Okay, this is, I think, my fourth or fifth take. I'm in the parking lot of, weirdly, there's a Verizon store here, and this is one of the worst parking lots in the world, as far as I can tell, for cell signal. So, this is pre-recorded. Uh, there's good lighting here, so I'm going to stay here as long as I can stand to read. The job is kicking my ass. But anyway, I'm wasting time. We're on chapter 18. Bears will kill you. Shall I tell you about the bears then? They are still something of a problem from time to time, and though the wolves have long since been tamed, and the last of the dragons slain as far as anyone knows, the bears are still part of the landscape to be wary of. I missed a lot of it personally, but I did make inquiries at some point. So here's the story of why we all still carry at least a little pepper spray and a noisemaker when walking in undeveloped territories. On old Earth, bears were among the most powerful land mammals in existence, and enough like men to have been a success story. They were generalists, as were men, though they found a comfortable form and occupied specific niches, which nullified the requirement for great intellect or nimble and dexterous hands, or the technologies that those factors enabled humanity to employ. Mighty then as they are now, bears might well have become the global food chain apex, and been the foil of early humans, had they learned but a single trick that eluded them until their species was reborn here on our world. I've told you already how much a mess there was in our beginning, and may even have understated things. Ubosathala, Larry called it, and sometimes Yog Sothoth, names he pulled from fictions of his own time, more of the many fables and myths that clung to the minds of earthly men since their earliest days, exciting their imaginations even if, as often, hobbling their intellectual growth. The myth in question described a being of protean and unthinking mass, a creator god, spawning and devouring from its own substance in perpetuity, a fountain of life and an abyss of death, a symbol for the creative and destructive property of nature cut as whole cloth. I cannot say how many worshipped such a being or for how long, but according to Larry, the fables endured Yellowstone, and carried on a while thereafter as contributors to culture and fashion and style, and, like some few such superstitions, left a legacy of impressive art and architecture. He gave the name to that beast, which he also calls Luca, when referring to He gave the name to that beast, which he also calls Luca, when referencing the one thought to have existed on old Earth, which we had here for a while, whose existence was owed in part to a miscalculation in exactly how much biomass foundation the world would need to eventually come to sustain the environment of living things that we enjoy. Larry claims that a similar creature once existed on Earth, though he could produce no direct evidence of it. One giant jellyfish taking up the whole space, is how he described it. And indeed these weird creatures are similar enough in form and consistency to let the image you conjure work. The guts of an egg, he also called it at one point. Only the egg is fertilized and twinned, and every time the embryo develops enough to begins gobbling up its twin parts. Each portion of each reticular or cellular appendage grown to become a predator on the other cell parts, and by that function of eating and pooping, replicating more and newer things within that egg, and so on in perpetuity. Which seemed to him to be a very unhappy thought. That was how the oceans of this world were for a while on the land fungal mold was the dominant force. Part of that same macroorganism, mind you, all the same critter from top to bottom. That critter, mind you, had a genome, which was a complete mashup of almost everything Larry brought in his gene bank, which included just a little of almost every living thing ever catalogued on Earth. It makes sense, thinking about it, that the sum of all living things would blend into such a simplistic and global representation of life. Stop it, Gravity. I'm doing stuff. Don't. A Frankenstein of everything that ever lived, grew out, or it, or got it, and taken on characteristics of every one of them to some extent. Mixing or adding new characteristics to each new bunch of thingies it pooped out to eat more thingies and so on. And though eventually on Earth it sorted itself out to masses of singular and distinct organisms, it might well have taken 1 billion years or more to do so. We didn't have that kind of time, he told me once. I should point out that a Frankenstein is a man-made monster built from parts of several dead things. There's a story there, but I'll not spoil it for you. It's in the libraries. Larry also sometimes calls it the Thing, more often Blob, which the asshole then pretends to confuse with my own name. Left to itself, that great global beastie might well still be the only living thing here on this world. Larry and Pete talked it over, and what came after was more or less a biological reset. They sent down some basic printers. Some of these were the same units, or at least the same make, as the ones which continued to generate the first men, and my own immediate ancestors. Nothing too fancy, and not of the grade needed to print out specific individuals. These vats were still plenty good for spinning together basic genetics and implanting them in pilot cells, from which more advanced creatures could be printed out or at least cultivated, or simpler creatures could be pasted together in whole form. Generations of simple algae and lichens had already been planted. Simple plants, sporoforms, fungi, all plenty and abundant, had already collapsed into the mega-organism, rather than root to form a diverse biosphere. They were replaced, of course, but those replacements were only an introduction to the solution. This phase was about eaters of those simpler things, and was, by and large, an indiscriminate generation of random samples of almost everything. Mollusks, insects, lizards, birds, and just whatever else there was for them to crank out that could eat blob and make more critters with distinct forms. Some things, a lot of them, just couldn't cope, and were reborn straight into a renewed extinction. The robots charged with wrangling the whole mess sorted out the survivors, and the successful forms, and over the course of a few thousand years they managed to retro-engineer a more or less stable, somewhat Earth-like biological latticework. Plants, plant-eaters, carnivores, and in every variety the abundance and diversity of terrestrial life had ever managed to come up with. Owing to the youth of the world and the wildness of the juvenile star, which is still occasionally expressing the pangs of its uncomfortable, too quick rush into adulthood, there was some deliberate favoritism, some handicaps taken on, and in the end a few cheats had to be employed to keep the whole thing from collapsing back into a single organic clutter, or some sampler plate of generic, nonspecific life. These cheats included a few phenotypes that Larry's world had not known, or at least had lost before the rise of mammals. The dragons we had to deal with, the weird beasties that are still the stuff of wood lore and tales told by sailors, these are, some of them, the things that were put into the mix to maintain that artificial lattice of what would eventually have to become a naturally balanced global ecosystem. This hodgepodge of advanced and primitive, This reboot of established and ancient and improvised terrestrial forms included the sharks, the cephalopods, the raptors, the ornithischia, the sauriscia, the bugs and beetles and spiders and flies, and so on and so forth. Also, eventually, wolves and bears, which, along with apes and cows, were originally slotted to enter production alongside the first men, or at least in proximity to them on the timetable. They did actually manage to hold off on many of the modern advanced things until the schedule called for them, even if the schedule had to be adjusted a bit. The wolves and bears and elephants and such, from whales to horses, though not exclusively mammals, they did get saved for last, which was again an adherence to myth as a sketch of a plan for Larry and the superminds that accompanied him in his task. By that time for men and such, the wrangling of life into something akin to Earth's environment had been managed well enough to pass, even if there were still some outliers. Some critters had found a niche, and were getting by even though they technically probably should not have existed at all. Wild cards in the game of evolutionary advancement is what happened. The best hopes were that the first men, printed straight out and sent forth to hobble around and discover their world, would find they had cattle, and would be able to keep dogs and ride horses if they could pull it off, and had only the native strangeness of this newly made world to struggle against. Wolves and bears might have given the first men some grief just at that, in their natural state. Those base model printed out replications of the beasts as they were on old Earth, and indeed there was some competition involved, but as it happened, the first men were not completely wiped out by those creatures, because those creatures were themselves still caught up in a greater struggle than was intended, working to carve out shares of territory and resources, vying against each other as well as everything else, and as such they were heedless of the new threat of encroaching human settlement for a while, there being so many much bigger problems at hand at the time. They were busy fighting dinosaurs. Now, as it turns out, some of these great ancient lizard-like beasts were just your average dumb animals, grazing, shambling critters or silent ambush predators, and even a few omnivorous and scavenging opportunists like the bears and the ancestors of Larrymen were. Some of them were perfectly developed for harmonious if anachronistic existence alongside their mammalian and avian successors. Some, as it turned out, were real, honest-to-goodness apex predators, wily, scheming team players with a real knack for slaughter and carnage and an unmatched veracity, an unmitigable hunger for anything they considered tasty, which in some cases included anything that caught their eye or had any kind of smell to it. This put their mammalian equivalents in an uncomfortable position. Not only was there a good deal of crossover in food sources, prey animals, and habitat, as there is now between yourselves and the current bears and a few other things, there was an overlap of all parties in that food animal category. Wolves and bears being tasty things, as it turns out, and the guts and muscles of predatory lizards, though not the first choice of the discerning mammalian palate, were nutritious, and would nearly always do in a pinch. A condition of everyone and everything eating everyone and everything else, in a caricature of that primordial soup's auto-cannibalism. Wolves fared better right off the bat. Bright, social, cooperative, and capable of making decisions as groups as well as individuals. The wolves sorted out pretty quick how to dodge, avoid, counter, and eventually match their theropodal equivalents. Gaining in size and intelligence over just a few generations, they were able to keep up and stay competitive. And of course, as men came to take their place on the surface, old alliances were reformed in some circumstances, which is how we manage to this day to have dogs that can be ridden, at least by children, or put to work pulling carts, even as we still have some pretty dire wolves to be wary of when walking in the deep woods. Bears had a different deal. As I said, the bears of old Earth were mighty things, and could stand taller than the tallest men, and wield several times their strength. Bright creatures as well, and capable of problem-solving, even of serious contemplations, if you take Larry's word for it. Nature's can-openers, he called them. And even in their natural state, they could be taught to work simple machinery, and even trained to dance and do simple tricks, and to behave themselves somewhat if one was careful and patient and respectful, or, as was, I'm told, more often the case, strict and fearsome and cruel. They were, however, solitary creatures. Just as a general rule, the closest thing they had to family units involved short-term mating periods and reasonably short single parenting spans, after which the bears of ancient Earth went on to forage and fish and do their thing with effectively zero cooperation, and in fact often violent and vicious competition amongst themselves. They could be found in groups only because they shared the same habits and habitats, and within these contexts their territorial instincts fell out as casually tolerant in times of abundance, trending towards lethal competition in leaner days. It worked for them. A species of strong and capable individualists whose evolutionary selection process carried them forward as such, able to find each other and get along well enough for breeding and birthing and weaning, and even some reputation for complacent, even amicable dispositions with regard to wintering. But mainly, a bear, once weaned, was on his own until his fate found him, and his libertarian attitude left him alone to face it. Parenting being the exception to that rule, and a point on which they garnered the reputation of being fierce guardians of their offspring, which rule remains in effect to this day. On this earth, that individualistic, even anarchic tendency was nearly the end of the bears. In their natural, original state, it took a whole team of wolves to take down a bear, and that was an oft-glorified and famous, if rare, natural combat in the pre-Larry Anthropocene era on old Earth. Sometimes the wolves would win, and sometimes it was the bear. But what the bears and wolves had in common was the sort of fair play understanding that mammals seem to have and share even when in predator-prey situations. More often than not, according to both Larry and some historical documents he's presented when it came to proving his assertions of how things went down, when wolves and bears came up against each other, there was, when avoidance was not an immediate option, mostly huff and puff, bluster and showmanship, and the two creatures would go on their way with something kin to respectful deference to their respective territorial pissings. In lean times, one might end up as food for the other, or killed as a final demonstration of the sincerity of some territorial claim, but for the most part these two animals did not tangle. The wolves stuck to snack-sized critters and staples and game prey and special treats for winter larders, while bears focused on fishing and foraging and scavenging things that other creatures left behind. Also, of course, who doesn't enjoy a random carcass where no effort is needed to grab a quick bellyful? And, of course, sometimes you had to make that carcass happen. "Picnic baskets," said Larry, and then had to explain to me what picnic baskets were. It was only his pronunciation that threw me off. I mention it here only because he found it absolutely hilarious that even after our survival of the first ice age, after your ancestors had even begun to play around with powered flight, There were still always fresh, new anecdotes from just anywhere and at all times of year about bears coming out of the woods to pillage the goods of travelers, or people who had made their homes too close to bear territory. They'd wander in silently during a snowfall, leaving no trace of themselves but the sudden and inexplicable lack of stored foods, and maybe a fecal pile as a parting fuck you to whoever had made the vain effort to stow their goods securely. It still happens, though not so frequently. The bears are a problem, but they are a modern problem, and generally leave us alone now, so long as they are shown the same respect. For a while there, and in fact for quite a long time, they were a real and constant threat, no matter where you were or what you were doing. It was their fight against the dinosaurs that made it so, and against the similarly adapted wolves that cemented it. They had to learn to cooperate, you see. Those damned lizards and other monsters from out of time, they had no fair play rules. Devastating solitary predators, and also extremely efficient pack hunters among them, and some even highly cooperative to the point of having something like a society among themselves, and they cared not a whit how big or how strong or how fierce you were. If they made the decision that you were food, they went about the work of eating you and did not stop until you were poop, regardless of any losses or damages incurred, and with quarter neither asked nor given. It took the bears a bit longer than it did wolves, and after many more generations of new bears being cranked out by printers, owing to their relatively low birth rate and infant survival rates, there were plenty of adaptations they could have managed. They might have learned to hide better, perhaps, though that would mean managing their scent. Bears stink to high heaven. Or being more clever diggers or climbers, which tasks they can accomplish with aplomb but do not commit to as careers. They could have become faster runners, or even have developed some offensive deterrent based on that musk they carry. Plenty of tricks that might have worked, or at least helped, perhaps. But what happened is they learned to cooperate. First, to congregate for mutual defense. And that alone took a lot of learning how to just not to be constantly and literally at each other's throats. Then, of course, they had to figure out at some point how to share and work collectively to secure and distribute their food properly. Individualistic, yes, but now with each individual required for and dependent upon the well-being of the family, the clan, tribe, and the race as a whole. Eventually, they learned how to group up and act in packs or pods. Family groups, then clans, and of course over time they became the tribes we know now, divided into the nations of blacks and browns and whites that we still have to this day. Mostly browns, which either extreme hue can breed into, which happens. But even though they remain dedicated generalists as a species, each tribal context requires some amount of specialization through adaptation, and as such, the whites keep claim on the poles and snow-capped mountains, blacks to the dense and shaded woods, while browns are common enough in any landscape, and their villages are to be found just about anywhere you look, where there aren't a lot of people or other monsters. It was a long, slow bit of progress for them, easy enough to figure out how their individual needs were best served by maintaining a safe proximity and congregation, maybe. But a while longer to sort out how to keep it up without turning against one another. Like the wolves, they got bigger, and bigger brains, and better ones, that let them sort out the particulars of social interaction, complex survival techniques, even some rudimentary tool use, and language, all as a byproduct of having to be better fighters. They learned to live lean and to keep their winter turpitude to a minimum. They learned to sleep in shifts, to share chores and bedding. They learned to keep vigil and to take turns standing guard against the threats they collectively faced. They still had a rough time competing against fast, adaptive, intelligent lizard monsters, but as they learned to comport themselves, they made improvements there as well. The humans were no help, and of course there were still wolves and other competitors for space and resources around, but the lizards were the ones that gave them real hell for quite some time. The bears were, in fact, almost completely gone again when my twin took off to avoid the raindowns. That first ice age gave them the advantage they needed against everyone, including the lizards, which were, though mainly homeothermic, not well suited for ice ages in general, and unlike bears, never acquired any measurable mastery of fire. Generalists from the start, bears were able to call on more abilities and practices as time moved on, and having learned to cooperate, could focus more as individuals on things beyond the next fish caught or the next grubs upturned. They developed rudimentary philosophy and language, and in almost exactly the same way as your own most ancient ancestors, they learned to get along more or less, and have been doing it with reasonable levels of success ever since. It's possible that someday in the far-off future you will have to do more than respect their space and avoid their territory, as their progress continues into an equivalent sapience. My own recommendation in that regard is to play nice, without being a doormat if you can manage it, and keep aside some space to share when the time comes. Let our alliance with the wolves be the beginning of the lesson, and then leave out the part where we became their owners and masters. The bears will, I promise you, not tolerate such domestic conditions, no matter how gilded the chains and cages. In those times, in that first glaciation, we had our caves of steel, and we had our ancient knowledge and technology. The bears had their own resources and survived the ice age that followed the raindowns without need for such cheats. Not only survived, but managed an increase. We were prepared to replace everything if we had to, all the animals, and even many of the plants, and anything we could not carry into our enclaves with us was at risk. Many things did not make it, and many more at least suffered a serious blow. Even the wolves, and most of what remained of the arguably inappropriate lizard things, and whatever else, they suffered tremendous losses, and had to begin again, if not from clone forms, then from next to nothing. Not so the bears. They had caves too, if not as fancy. They mastered fire, developed something akin to agriculture, developed trade and diplomacy, and even wherever they had some deficiency in form or function, they made do. Just as our predecessors on Earth, they came together to survive that ice age, through communal and cooperative efforts beyond even those needed to combat their natural adversaries. They not only did not extinct, they progressed during that time. We would have found our own world intolerably inhospitable. Going forward, as the glaciers began to recede, we learned to give them some respect and space, which was easy enough considering the difference in preferred climates. They do not cake themselves with mud and cover themselves with hat and cape and endure the sun and boiling earth as we do, but stick to the cool and cover of the wood, and walk naked in the deepest snows, and swim casually through waters that would murder men in moments. The climate, however, is shifting again, which sounds like I mean to say it has ever stopped, but we are at one of those points where the shift is comparatively abrupt. More ice ages have come and gone, and our two species have survived and prospered despite, even if there have been moments where it seemed in doubt. And there is a new ice age coming, heralded by the seemingly contraindicative increase in atmospheric and oceanic temperatures which has allowed your civilization its most recent period of expansion. As our lands thus begin to give way to waters, and our territories begin again to encroach on theirs, we must be careful to keep the peace. They have no robots, not yet, nor much more complicated technology than eyeglasses and millstones, but they are still beyond us in strength, in the skills of the hunt, and in overall durability. It is best we learn to get along. Should it come to conflict, humanity will surely triumph, but at great cost not only to human life, but to the sum of all life, and a devastating and tragic loss of what might be the only non-human sentient beings in the entire universe, robotics and other children of men notwithstanding. Their extinction at your hands would be the greatest tragedy since the destruction of whales and elephants and apes by human ineptitude on old Earth, which broke Larry's heart when he heard of it, and set his mind to thoughts of war. Those creatures have been resurrected and preserved here, and perhaps on old Earth as well at some point, but the correction of the problem does not mitigate, in that man's mind, the horror and hubris that caused it. If not for the sake of life and out of respect for your fellow sentient beings, let the ire of the Moon Man stand as a deterrent. He can, as I may have said, as easily unmake this world and begin again from scratch, should he so desire. Just some thoughts to consider as far as that goes. Larry likes the bears. He likes you too, but the nature of his presence here renders your entire civilization, every last man, woman, and child of you, fungible. Larry has already made some overtures on your behalf, of course. He's managed to make friends even, after a fashion. Not so much peace with the bears, mind you, as something of a friendship with a few bears every now and again. I doubt in any of his iterations he will be enthusiastically welcomed into any bear communities, or offered any bear chief's daughter for marriage, but he does have some over from time to time for fishing and beer and supper. At least, for the moment, we no longer have to worry about their active attempts to make us their food animals. Bears will still eat you if you stumble across them and are not circumspect, wary, and prepared. But they are not committed enemies, and are easy enough to dissuade if you have some pepper spray, or a good loud gun, or even bells and whistles. They have changed as much and more as men in their time spent on this world, but their love of silence and their sensitivity to noise and smells have not diminished. They need some respect and a wide berth, and to not be tempted. But if provided these courtesies, they are almost universally willing to mind their own business. Most of you are too new to remember, even in your histories, their various campaigns to become the planetary top predators. Those early years when they would simply attack villages and communities and travelers and loot and maul and vanish again into the woods. The later tactics of setting up ambushes in various places along the roads between towns, and then that longest and most vile method employed to turn unwitting humans into bear poops. Cuteness. They really are adorable, and so much so that when we come across them we cannot help but be tempted to stop and watch. They figured that out about us, and used our curiosity and our natural love of cuteness and sweetness and of fluffy, cuddly things to dire advantage. There they would sit, then, all cute and furry and harmless, doing mesmerizingly adorable things and being just so lovable and sweet that sooner or later someone would just absolutely have to get close enough for a hug. It really is embarrassing how often this ploy worked, and for how long. Literally just century after century of people trying to cuddle up and getting mauled and looted for their trouble. Larry was only around for the very last days of that particular phase of ursine attrition. I'd been present, but focused on other things. The day-to-day stuff, I'll tell you, has just never been part of my deal, and if your ancestors had come to wage more serious wars on each other or the bears, I likely would not even have noticed until it escalated to nuclear confrontation, or until the robotic component alerted me of the imminent extinction of one species or the other. Larry, though, even if he is less concerned even than myself with the trends and fashions of passing generations, will invariably sit down and watch the reruns and catch up on what all issues and events he can. One has to have hobbies, and more so as one approaches immortality. I am fond of pottery myself. At the time of this writing, I'm really getting quite good. Larry's secret robots are still here and have been around this whole time. You see, they don't step in without a go-ahead from myself or Larry. But they are always watching. Some of them, which I may tell you more about later, are pretty bright fellows. And I know what to look for, and will focus their attention on things they think Larry or I will get a kick out of. Fuzzy bear tactics never fail to amuse. Some of them pretty bloody and sad and tragic, but as histories go, a compilation of thousands into the millions of people being fooled by adorable doe-eyed slaughterhouses comes out as really just very entertaining stuff, I have to say. Larry watched for hours, for days, and over the course of a few years made a couple hours of bear attack videos part of his daily routine. More fun, he said, than Kicked in the Balls Network, which is apparently popular in his day. Yes, an entire entertainment network, broadcast network, featuring the many ways in which human beings can sustain groin injuries of whatever severity. We come from a very strange stock, though I must admit I spent a few hours transfixed myself when that old bastard called me over to watch with him. Killed by bears, he insisted, would have been a hit show. It was that lifetime in which Larry started trying to get on the bear's good side. He failed, and that was the first version of Larry to be killed by bears. He'd made his save, though, and went back within a year to become the second iteration to be killed by bears. His third appearance before them made an impression. 5 Larrys in, they were impressed enough to be afraid. Not overawed, mind you, but just so much as to pause long enough that Larry could get a few ideas across to them and make a few small strides towards establishing a meaningful dialogue. People all look alike to them, more or less, so it took them a while to figure out that there was this one guy that kept showing up, no matter how many times they killed him, and no matter how well they disposed of his body. We don't all smell the same, but similar enough that 3 to 5 people having the same scent wouldn't tip them off. They kept on killing him, though, and until old Larry finally made the decision to bring a cadre of robotic bodyguards, they didn't really get the message. By going into the woods protected, and then by facing down one mob of bears, Larry finally got his point across. After that now famous amongst bears and robots showdown, bear attacks began to decrease in frequency overall, and the cuddly kills almost entirely vanished. He did not act to save mankind, nor even to save the bears from their own cunning. Larry went down there into the woods to commune with the bears just and only for his own amusement, just because that's the kind of jackass he is. Which is now how our Creator, the maker of this world, also became the first deity ever believed in by bears. The first we know about anyway, and probably the last, and only a minor deity, only owing to how owing to how irreligious those creatures are in general. His subsequent dealings with the bears had nothing at all to do with the impression he made back then, which inspired some belief in supernatural men amongst the Ursine tribes, but made for only small shifts in their attitude towards humans in general. He just got better at dealing with them, and they had made some progress towards being less indiscriminately violent toward men. The bears he took fishing just a while back neither knew he was the mythic figure spoken of in the fables their ancestors passed down, nor did they seem to believe in those ancient fables. For all their flaws, bears are, as it turns out, pretty well grounded and immensely skeptical creatures. For this reason alone, it's still to this day smarter just to steer clear of them. Should you happen to meet a bear, just be as straightforward and honest as you can be. Show neither fear nor hubris, and keep the pepper spray handy just in case. They may be passive or aggressive, or both, but they will never under any circumstances buy any of your bullshit. I have no information about what Larry said or did in his meetings with the bears back then, or at least no great detail to give regarding the visit which resulted in his elevation from potential snack to demigod. He had control over the robots, and I was neither advised or invited. You'd have to ask the bears and sort it out from whatever remains of the truth in the stories they tell. I'm certain only of two things regarding those meetings. Some of the robots didn't survive, and dozens of barrels of beer were consumed. Hell of a party, is all Larry ever said about it.